Hello, this is Jasmine, and today I'm going to be talking about how to use watercolor in your sketchbooks. Let's start with a sketchbook. Nothing fancy, but mixed media paper should be a good middle ground. Then we'll need some water. I like to grab 2 cups so that I have one to rinse and be really dirty and one to rinse a second time and have a cleaner brush. We'll need watercolor. Again, it doesn't have to be fancy, we're just getting started. Brushes are where I would splurge for something slightly higher quality because you want watercolor brushes. Then again, ye old cheapy brush will work as well. One of my newest favorite additions is ballpoint pen and water-based markers. They don't have to be watercolor markers, just water-based markers. If you're feeling really fancy, you can top it off with a pen and a white gel pen. I like Jelly Roll, and Microns are both waterproof and alcohol marker proof. I'm actually going to be using this beat up old mixed media sketchbook. It's basically the same thing as this, but it's a Canson XL brand, and it has quite a lot of color in it, and it's still holding up pretty good. If you're concerned about using watercolor in your sketchbook, we'll start out slow. In fact, we're going to start out with a swatch page of our materials. Now, you could use the very back of your sketchbook if you don't want swatches in the middle. I'm going to be using these Cra-Z-Art paints. They're notoriously bad, but this is just about getting started and finding out if you even like watercolor. I'm also going to be using various ballpoint pens. I already know that these ones are water soluble, but again, it's another good reason to have a swatch page. For really cheap paints, you generally need to wet them first for a while. A lot of people will think that the paints are not pigmented enough to paint with at all, but oftentimes the problem is just that they take a long time to soak in the water. I'm going to be using a decent brush, not this terrible plastic one, and I'm going to take my water and I'm going to just get the brush damp and tap it off on a paper towel, just a little bit, and then I'm gonna start swatching. You need to stir it up a bit. You can tell that this pigment is very separating. And see, it's Cra-Z-Art, but it's not that bad for, particularly for a sketchbook. I'm going to wash my brush in this water, and then I'm going to take clean water and rinse my brush again. Tapping it off and going on to the next color. These paints are washable, which may affect the way that they lay down and stain. This blue is actually extremely nice, and right next to this yellow, it really gives me like egg dye vibes, like from Easter. See how this water is much more clear? Our brush is staying nice and clean. When you're rinsing your brush in the water, don't go directly up and down and squish the bristles. You want to go at an angle and twist to clean those bristles. Now we've got our swatches of our paints laid down, and that's very nice, but we're going to see if they blend out at all to get a lighter color. Now I know they will if I just add a lot of water here, but are they reactivatable? Is that a word? Anyway, so we're going to get some water on our brush, and then we're just going to come to a dry spot and see how well we can blend out the edge. Now it doesn't look like the edge is going to be able to blend out very much. I believe that these are more dye based than pigment based, which means that they stain more and they don't lift up as well. That being said, this is a good example of how pale the colors can get. So you should always do a swatch that is more pure and a swatch that is more watered down. Generally speaking, higher quality paints will be easier to work with, more pigmented, and less chalky. So just as I thought, these colors do not like to lift up very much once they're set. And a lot of people would consider that a bad thing, but as long as you know that, you can use that to the best of your advantage and be able to do things such as put a lot of layers of color down without disturbing the layers beneath. It's time for a water change already. I like to use my small shot glasses for water, because it really makes me change the water a lot more frequently because it's such a small size. I'm going to set these aside. I'm probably not going to use them for the stuff that I do in this book. I just wanted to show you that they are perfectly acceptable. I'm now going to start with one of my favorite things to do in my sketchbook lately, which is using ballpoint pens. Now, it's important to test your ballpoint pens because different ballpoint pens might break down in water in completely different ways than other pens, and some don't break down at all. I have found that these Sharpie S gels are really amazing. I love them. You'll also find that black pens sometimes break down into cool colors and sometimes break down into warm colors. This is my favorite pen, the Sharpie S Gel in blue, because you'll see in a moment it breaks down really, really pretty. I'm going to pull the Sharpie S Gel in here and put it next to this purple so that you can see how different colored pens can break down into different pigments. I'm also going to swatch a couple water-soluble markers. These are pretty much just markers that are not alcohol-based markers or like Sharpies. Sharpies are a little different. I'm not sure what they are. But this is just a regular kids marker, calligraphy marker, something like that. Now that we have our pens and marker down, I'm going to use a bigger brush because I just want to get a lot of water on there. And I'm going to soak it, and then I'm going to dab it off just a little and just go right in there and swatch over the top. I'm going to start by putting a lot of water directly on top, and then I'm going to slowly pull it out and then dab it off, get a little bit more water on there, and then pull it back to see what variation of pigment we can get. So this is the purple Sharpie S Gel, and you'll see that the other purple pen that I have breaks down into a different color, and I just think that this is one of the funnest ways to use watercolor in your sketchbook. It is sort of watercolor, but sort of mixed media. Some pens will also break down more in the water than others will. Some pens will almost disappear, and other pens will leave a very distinct ghosting. This is my all-time favorite, and you will see in a moment why, because I pull it out and it's very beautiful blue, right? But you'll see as I uncover the part where the initial ink was, that it's purple, and it just can make some very, very pretty gradients. And I absolutely love it. I haven't found another pen that does the same. And you see we've got some purple down here. but the blue Sharpie S gel breaks down both blue and purple. Now we're on to our markers, and these also break down quite well. Again, these are not watercolor markers. In fact, I consider watercolor markers to be a gimmick because they rarely ever actually completely disappear in the water, and regular water-based markers do the same thing. Our page is starting to buckle a little bit. I'm going to give it a moment to dry out, and then I'll be back to say a little more. I feel like it's also important to point out that the more water you put on your page, the more likely you are to get harsh lines like this, where the pigment is separating along essentially the water line. And sometimes you can blend that out more often if you have higher quality watercolors, and it's also easier on higher quality paper. But that being said, if you don't put as much water down, see, this is where there was a lot of water and I was pooling, I had the brush very saturated, but if you don't have that much water, then there's a much more gradual transition. So real quickly, I'm going to show you guys the difference between these and a high quality watercolor. So these are Winsor & Newton watercolors. Another important thing to do is to test how chalky your watercolors are. This is seen most easily with yellow, and you put down a waterproof ink line. This is a micron pen, and then you just lay your colors down and see if they're transparent or if they leave a chalkiness. These colors are definitely a bit more pigmented. However, these ones are perfectly fine, especially if you're not doing finished pieces in your sketchbook. Now that all of this is dry, you can see that the paper has buckled a little bit. That's never really an issue for me. You fold the book flat and eventually, you know, the buckling isn't that strong. And it also, with these cheaper sketchbooks, sometimes they start to peel apart at the perforation. That's not really a big deal. I'll just stick a piece of tape there. This piece of tape is covered in cat fur like everything else in my life. So yeah, I've had to put some tape on quite a few of these pages, but again, it's not really a big deal to me. If it is a big deal to you, then you might want to not go so heavy with watercolor. It may also just be because it's an old book. With our swatches done, let's get on to some actual tips and tricks for adding watercolor to your existing sketchbook spreads. The first trick I'm going to teach you, we're starting out slow, is to add a pop of color around a sketch that you like, but you don't necessarily want to color the full thing in. You just want to add some color to the spread and really emphasize the parts that you like. I'm going to go ahead and use these again because why not? So for this particular technique, I'm going to wet my brush a little, and I want to use purple right now, but I don't necessarily want a super dark purple. So I'm gonna get my brush very saturated, and then I'm going to drop the ink over here onto my palette. I'm gonna dip my brush again, get some more water into it, and water that down. And I'm going to do that again until I have, I think, the lightness that I would like. And then I'm going to tap off my brush on my paper towel. And then I can just make sure my brush is damp and then go into this mixture that I've made, and it should be lighter than it was before. I'm going to just go around anything that I really like. I'm not being too precise with like a shape that I'm going around. Like I'm not worried about the edges. I'm just like putting some fun, energetic color here. I'm using a very large brush, but you might feel more comfortable using a small brush, and you might not want to go over any of the lines like I do, but I'm not too concerned about being very clean and precise. My sketches tend to be just a lot more rough and all over the place. Now to fade the edges out a little bit, I'm going to leave the pigment on my brush, but I'm going to dip it in water. This is quite strong. I'm going to tap my brush off, just like I did with the swatches. Add some more water. There we go. Now it's starting to fade out. But you shouldn't feel obligated to fade it out as much as I'm doing right here. In fact, you don't have to fade it out at all. It can be really fun just to have a very hard edge. Now, one of the things about the cheaper quality of paints is that it'll be a little harder to get a gradient usually. Because it is dye-based and it soaks in immediately, there's not a lot of working it around the page. In case you're curious about what I'm working on, these are all monsters and items from a particular area in the MMO video game Final Fantasy XI. And just like that, we've added a cute little pop of color to our page. But now I'm going to address the next thing. The next tip I have is to seal in graphite sketches. So this is going to be a really quick and simple one. I'm getting a very light wash, which means I'm adding a lot of color to this pigment, a lot of water to this pigment. And I'm adding more than I would with my regular paints because the pigments in these, the dyes, is quite strong. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this wash and I'm just going to go directly over the top of a sketch that I have. This is a fun way to add a pop of color, and what I'm essentially doing is I'm using the watercolor to seal in the graphite so that it no longer will transfer to the other page, because you know, if you have a sketchbook, that if you use graphite in it, quite frequently the graphite will smudge, it will transfer over onto this page over here, and it will just not look good after a while, and some sketch that you're really proud of, farther down the line you won't even be able to tell the details of, because it'll be so fuzzy. But when you do this, you can just seal it all in and it won't transfer any longer, and it'll add just like a cute little pop of color and a bit of aesthetic to your page. This right here is an example of quite a large piece. Oftentimes I'll have a bunch of smaller pieces that I would color with different colors, and then they stop transferring. I've got kind of a rainbow going on, but this was a big large piece that definitely needed sealed in because there was so much graphite on it. Another thing about this particular technique is that if you have larger areas like this that you do, or like a lot of small things on the paper, you are going to experience a little more buckling than if you just did one or two small little pieces. Again, it doesn't really bother me. The book will eventually flatten, and I think it adds some character to it. For my third technique, we're not going to be using the paints at all. We're going to be using water-soluble pens and markers to create something kind of similar to this. So I flipped to a page that is mostly empty. It's just got this one character on it. And I want to fill up some of the blank space, and this is one of my favorite techniques. So I'm going to probably sketch something first and then use the pens and some water, and we'll see where it goes from there. So because this is a Final Fantasy VII piece, I decided to go with some cute chocobos, which if you know the game, you know they can be almost any color. And the entryway to Gold Saucer up here, and just some balloons for some fun pops of color. I love a lot of color in my sketchbook. I'm going to zoom you in a bit here to see what I'm doing, and I'm going to make a green, a purple, and a blue chocobo. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my pen, and I'm going to see my pencil lines, and I'm just going to trace over them. If there's an area that I want to be a lot darker, like in shadow, I'll maybe add some cross-hatching to it. Or in the case of the eye, I'm going to color it completely. So now comes the really fun part. I'm going to wet my brush and I'm going to dab it off a little, and I'm just going to start coloring. I'm going to get the paper wet and go all the way up to the edge, and as you can see, it's already blending. And I'm just going to move this pigment around. As you can tell, it's darker there. If there's patches that I want to be in highlight, I can just like leave them white, like if I wanted to leave these areas in like a bright highlight. Now the thing about this is that it does normally blur the pen quite a lot, but it's okay because once it dries, you can just go back over it with the pen again and sharpen up those lines, the ones that you want to, leave the ones that you want faded to be kind of faded. And it's just a really, really fun way I have found to work in your sketchbook, and a little bit of water goes a long ways. And you can just have fun and not worry about making a masterpiece, because this is literally a ballpoint pen doodle. So just have at it, you know? I personally like to leave some hard edges like this highlight under the eye. And it's also important to note that because these two are right next to each other, I could work on the color of this one right now and it would all kind of bleed together where it touches. But generally speaking, I like to let one completely dry while I work on a completely separate one, and then when this is dry I can come back here, and it might still activate it because this pen activates very easily, but it's less likely to just completely blend together. Now, one of my favorite things to do when I'm doing this, and I've got some pieces filling up the edges of this sketchbook, but I also kind of want to just add like splashes of color. And I like to just add color here and there. Sometimes I'll even take a pen and, I don't know, draw like a circle or a star. Like real loosely, just having fun with it. And then I will go over them just so that we've got some cool looking designs along the edges, and not everything is just so blank white space. Even though we do have some colors filling up the whole thing, I also like to get the edges quite a bit. Another really easy way to get the edges is to do something like make grass, just by putting like some scribbles of a green water-soluble pen down. And it doesn't have to be green, you can use any color honestly to be like a ground kind of color. And then just go over it, and I like to go almost up to the figures, but I don't want it to actually mess with the figures and like their silhouette. So I just kind of go like this and pull it all over the place, fade it here and there, and it just gives the page a bit more interest. And it also grounds the characters a little bit. So now that this green one is completely dry, I'm going to go in and get the blue one. Again, we might have a little bit of the colors fading together here, but not nearly as much as if this green one was still wet. You've probably guessed this by now, but you can also mix these pens up. So I mixed blue and black here, and you know, I've got some green down here and the purple that's hopefully going to be kind of pink up here, and it'll just kind of all mix together however you put it, just like with regular paints. Just like I suspected, I got a nice dark color by mixing the blue and black in the mouth of this entryway. Gonna try not to hit those balloons down there. I don't mind too much when my colors touch a little bit, because bounce lighting will kind of do that, and also it's a sketch. I actually sometimes add a little bit of the other colors just to simulate bounce lighting. And then I blend it a little bit. And I just think it's kind of a cool effect. My final tip for this kind of technique is to go in with a pen and touch it up, and maybe even a white gel pen for highlights, especially when some things maybe didn't turn out quite as well as you thought they would. My final tip is going to be a little bit scary, and that is to combine our materials and whatever it is we want to use to actually color in a full piece in our sketchbook. Now, I don't recommend doing this until you are comfortable with using watercolors in your sketchbook in other ways, so that you know you really won't mess up your piece. But again, don't worry too much. It is just a sketchbook and you want to have fun. So right away, her eyes are a very kind of teal color, and I think this is the closest I have, which is actually a marker and not a watercolor itself. So I'm going to go in very carefully and add just a bit. I'm going in pretty much straight with watercolor in this more finished piece, and I'm being a lot more precise. You can actually even use gouache if you want to in your sketchbook. Just make sure you don't build up the layers too heavily. I'm also going in with multiple layers of color, which I didn't really do in any of the other tips. It wasn't really necessary just for those pops of color. But here I'm going in and getting all the base colors down, and then adding just one secondary layer to add some shading. And I go in a little bit with some red for things like the cheeks and to add a little bit of red, but keep in mind this is mixed media sketchbook paper, and it's not going to take watercolor blending nearly as well as like actual real watercolor. I know that I've already passed it at this point, but honestly that tail flame was so fun. I just decided to paint it like that as a wet on wet technique, and I really enjoyed it. Let me know if you want to see like a more in-depth video. I've been practicing it a little bit. I'm having a lot of fun with the fire. But yeah, and then I go in with some pen at the end to just really tighten things up and make it all look more finished. It's not the kind of quality that I would put out there necessarily as a print, although maybe if I touch it up a little bit, I am pretty happy with how it turned out. I think it's kind of interesting that I randomly sketched one of my favorite characters from Final Fantasy VII with one of my least favorite characters from Final Fantasy VII. So let me know in the comments which character you think is one of my favorites and which one you think is one of my least favorites. Oh, these squishy toe beans on Red 13 were so fun to ink. So I think we're wrapping up the video now. I really hope that these tips were helpful for you to get started and get over maybe a fear of using watercolor in your sketchbook. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You just gotta start throwing some color on there, having a lot of fun. Honestly, I've only recently started using watercolor in my sketchbooks and it has been a blast. I love it. And even though my sketchbook is like a bit poofed out from the pages being a little warped, I just think it gives it so much character, and I love flipping through my sketchbook now that it has a bunch of color in it instead of just straight graphite drawings. This is the beginning of a watercolor series that I'm doing, so I'm going to give you a lot more beginners tips and tricks, and maybe even some stuff that advanced watercolor artists could use, although I'm personally not that advanced at watercolor yet. But I hope that you found it very helpful, and here's my little helper that was with me the whole time. If you want more stuff like this and you enjoy my art, I am Jasmine Zelmer on Twitter and Instagram and just about everywhere. JasmineZelmer.com is my website, and you can even find me on Patreon if you would like to get some prints or stickers. I've got tiers where you can get just stickers or just prints, but no matter what, you get access to asking for personalized tutorials, and you get photo packs for reference and all kinds of fun stuff. Well, thanks for stopping by.